My name is Helen Forgas and I am the Associate Dean for the Clayton campus. So it is my pleasure to welcome everybody here tonight. It's good to see a lovely audience coming out to support this particular last one of the series for 2014. At this point I'd like to pass over to Jo Depler. Jo knows the work of Umesh really well, and she has worked very closely with him over the years, and so she is going to introduce him to you. So over to you, Jo.
Thank you, Helen. Before I introduce Umesh, just one little thing of housekeeping. If you come here and you've registered for this event and you need a certificate of attendance, would you please see Sam in the pink jacket after, and she will present you with your certificates. I had the pleasure of being on the interview selection panel when Umesh Sharma first was interviewed for a position in the Faculty of Education in 2002. And it was pretty clear from the outset that he was going to be a researcher of some renown. He was only 1 year past his PhD, and already he had established himself as a researcher. Since then, he has developed an international reputation in teacher education, in inclusive and special ed. In a number of international contexts, including Canada and the US, the UK, Singapore, Hong Kong, and in many developing countries as well, China, India, Brunei. And currently he leads a project in 14 Pacific countries, which I also have the privilege of participating in. I have worked in a number of projects with Umesh over the years, and although we're both in inclusive education, we draw on different research literature. We use different research methods, but we have, I think, a strength in that, and have successfully supervised jointly students as well as working in a number of national and international projects. It is therefore my absolute pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleague, Associate Professor Umesh Sharma.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you very much, Jo, for wonderful words. And I mean, I really appreciate your friendship and mentorship, I have to say. And thank you very much for selecting me in 2001 for this job that I'm really enjoying working at Monash. Let me start with this lecture, like, are we preparing teachers for inclusion or exclusion? I think I started thinking about this topic when I was in year 10. And it's in year 10 when I was suspended from my school for misbehavior. Oh. So I think if you think about the roots of these lectures, when you come to present about Dean's lecture, and this is an important event, and you start thinking about what is the topic I want to present on this important day. And I thought I'll talk about something that is very close to my heart. And so I hope what I'm going to do today is talk about some of the issues in this field that are largely influenced by our research, but also from the research of other people who are working in this area. And I hope that maybe you'll get something out of this lecture that you'll find useful for your own context, whether you're teaching or you're working in a school, you're a school principal, or in a special school. So let's start the journey. So the topic is, are we preparing teachers for inclusion or exclusion? I want to start with some statistics, some facts. 10% of the world's population, or almost 650 million people, have a disability, and large proportion of these people, almost 80% of them, they live in developing countries. 1/3 of that population are children who are school-going children. And less than 10%, in some countries they say even less than 2% of those kids go to have any form, they get access to any form of education. And I'm talking about this population. This is the work, I mean, this is the population we are talking about. It's also true, even in countries like Australia, Canada, we do know that students are getting access to education, but Are they getting the education that they deserve? And if they are not getting what they deserve, who is responsible? And where do you go and start asking? So what I'm presenting today is more questions rather than all the answers today. I want to start with a quote that I find very useful. Teaching is a difficult skill that requires intensive training, practice, and professional development. Would someone who proposed to put an uncertified or unprepared teacher in a classroom ever think of having the gallbladder removed by new nature? We doubt it. Yet these folks are enthusiastic about having unskilled teachers perform operations on our children. Now, before we start talking about are we preparing teachers for inclusion and exclusion, it's important for us to understand what is inclusion and how is that different for exclusion. For us to understand this, it's important for us to go back into the history. Look at the history of disability, what has happened to people with disability historically. If you look in the history of disability, people with disability, eugenics has been a very common practice. People with disabilities were killed because they had a disability. There was a legal requirement to kill a disabled child during Roman and Greek period. Infants who appeared defective were thrown from a cliff on Mount Taygetus, it's in Greece, and they were left to die over there on those mountains. Early Romans gave power to father to have absolute rights over his children. He could kill his child if he or she was disabled or deformed. Disabled were denied Greek or Roman citizenship. So this is the history. This is what we are talking about. You know, when we talk about inclusion and exclusion. So what has happened as a result of this history? As we move forward a few hundred years, we started talking about what is the best way to treat people with disability in our system. And we started thinking about if people with disabilities are quite different, let's think about rather than killing them, can we do something else? Can we put them into different settings? So that's where the history started. We started with special schooling or institutionalization. But one fundamental thing that was happening is we always thought there is something different in people with disabilities. They have something that makes them quite different. And if you can think of those differences as 4 different corners, that almost like a square which cannot fit into our regular school society. As we move forward in our history, people started talking about can some of those kids, can they be changed? Can we cut those corners? And would that fit in our school system? So we started thinking, oh, let's change this child. Let's toilet train him. Let's change his behavior. Let's do something about it, and they will fit into our school system. So that's where the movement toward integrated education started. Remember, at this time, we were only including some kids in our regular school system. We were not including all kids. These were the kids who would fit into our system. These were the kids who are ready to change. So the system was not changing. Our schools remained only for kids who are round kids. But the kids with disabilities, if they wanted to come to our school, they had to change. Inclusive education is quite different. It's a complete paradigm shift where what we believe is that everyone is different, and for us to provide inclusive education, we need to believe that those differences are a strength in our system. So for us to provide better education to them, we need to believe in this paradigm that children are different, all children can learn, and differences can range from ethnicity, their learning abilities, and things like that. Inclusive education is about responding to diversity. It's about listening to unfamiliar voices, being open, empowering all members about celebrating difference in dignified ways. Now, what is exclusion then? Before I talk about this, what I also want to talk about inclusive education is people talk about inclusion as something in addition to what they're doing in their schools. So if they're providing education, quality education, they say we will also do inclusion. What I believe is this is not the way we should be looking at inclusive education. It should be the foundation to provide quality education. So schools that say we cannot provide inclusive education will not be able to provide quality education to all kids. So in some ways, inclusive education has to be at the foundation to provide quality education, to provide better education to all children. So if you think about this triangle, inclusion has to be at the foundation. What do you think about this? What do you think about Mr. Jones here? what I want to say is some people think that they can provide inclusive education few days, or they say my school is really good in providing education to these kinds of children, but we cannot do inclusion. And I think there is something wrong with their thinking, because if you say that we cannot provide inclusion on all 5 days, you're almost saying that we do not provide quality education on 5 days. So there is something that it needs to be very clear from the outset, that inclusive education is foundation to providing good quality education to all children. Now, what is exclusion? And people have been asking, what is exclusion and how is that different? And Roger Sleeve is also a very good friend, and he wanted to come here today, but he's in Ethiopia. He says, I can't come. He says, let's look at who is in, who is out, and how come. So who comes into the system, who comes into our schools, who cannot come into our schools, and why is that they cannot come into our schools? Why can't they enroll in our schools? He also talks about exclusion is everywhere. He says, like, if you go around, you can talk to your school system, you'll find there are some people are excluded. He also talks about exclusion happen in the classroom. You could be a part of a classroom, but still you could be excluded. So you are in a classroom, you are physically present, but you can be excluded by the things that teachers do, or what happened in that classroom system. So exclusion is everywhere, it does happen everywhere. What I want to talk about is, disability is the most significant factor in relation to exclusion from education than gender or geographical location in developing countries. And when you talk about this, large number of people with disabilities, they never enroll in a school system, whether it's a regular school system or a special school system. They drop out more frequently, and even if they are enrolled, they remain invisible in the classroom. So they will stay in the class, but teachers rarely interact with those students, or there are no peers to play with, or they are bullied more often in the school system. So this is what we are talking about. They are excluded even though they could be in the classroom, but large proportion could never get into the system. And this is where I think it's important for us to ask, what is the reason behind why is this happening, and can there is something happening in our teacher education be changed? Can something be improved what we are doing in our teacher education? And that's the question that I want to talk about today. I want to reflect on our teacher education, and these reflections have come from some of the work done by UNESCO and some of the work done by our PhD research students. If you look at something like what's happening in our teacher education, that what we know when teachers finish, when graduates finish their teacher education program, they learn that inclusion is good but impossible. And they learn that some children will not learn whatsoever, so they can try everything possible, but some children will continue to struggle. They will not learn. They learn very little about teaching strategies that allow for inclusion. And they rarely get a chance to practice inclusion in real life settings. I'm talking about during the time of teacher education. So we talk about inclusion, but we know during the time of their teacher education, they do not get chance to practice inclusion. They don't go to those schools where they have to learn about this. And they are not convinced that they should include all children. And we have done this research, like we have talked to our pre-service teachers at the end of the program. They say, yes, I'm happy with this child, but I'm not going to include a child who is going to display severe challenging behavior in my class. So they're always struggling with this idea, who should be included and who should not be included. I want to talk about, there was a large scale survey was done by UNICEF recently. It was 2012, not 2002, where they sent these surveys to the teacher educators, deans of education in different countries, in fact, 111 countries. And what they found, that in 30% of those, 33% of respondents said that we do not talk about inclusive education in our teacher education programs. And I want to talk about, this is also true in Australia. So there were some respondents from Australia, and we know in Victoria, it's not a requirement for teachers to learn about inclusion. So it's not mandatory for teachers to do a unit or course on inclusive education, even though it's a requirement in other states in Australia. So who is to blame? Now, if you think about this situation, I think we really need to start thinking about who needs to be blamed here. I think, in my view, it's me. People like me in teacher education needs to be blamed. I want to show you a short video before we move forward.
everyone's here, we can begin. Before we do, I just talked to Leonard, and if you're going to spend all your time trying to belittle me by making this class unnecessarily hard, then I'm out. If you're interested in making a sincere effort to be a good teacher, then I'm willing to give this a shot. I suppose that's a fair request. There's no reason we both can't benefit from this experience. Okay. Well then, first things first, are you familiar with the brachistochrone problem?
I am.
And how it relates to the calculus of variations?
It's an inverted cycloid.
Wonderful. Now, what about Euler-Lagrange theorems?
That's where I'm a little fuzzy.
Ha! I knew it! All right. We have a lot of information to cover before your first test, which, by the way, is in 8 minutes. The good news is I'm grading on a curve, so you're pretty much guaranteed a C.
All I do is win, no matter what.
What are you doing?
Everybody's hands go up, and they say that.
What are you doing?
If you're going to be a crappy teacher, then I'm going to be a crappy student. Let's go in on the birds because I never been a feeling and I won't stop now.
No, wait, stop it! This is a classroom. This is not American Bandstand. Okay. Now, where was I? Let's see. Oh, yes, over here. What are you doing now?
Making a straw
Why?
so I can shoot you with a spitball.
You're not going to do that, and I'll tell you why. This is an institution of higher learning. I am your professor, and you're going to treat me with the You shot your spit in my mouth!
Is that going to be on the test? Because I don't think I can do that again.
So this is what we're talking about. We are talking about, I think, disabled teachers rather than disabled students. Okay. Now, implications. If people like me, people like Sheldon, are unprepared to change, they are not prepared to change their practices or what they do in teacher education. If we talk about countries like Australia, it may not be such a huge problem. But when we talk about developing countries like India, if teacher educators are not prepared to change, it's going to be a huge problem. So if you think about teacher education or teachers involved in teacher education program, they are preparing pre-service teachers. So these are the teachers that are going into school system, and what are they doing in their school system? They say, I'm not going to teach this child because he or she has this problem, or he has a disability or this thing. What happens as a result of this? A large number of people with disabilities never enroll, they drop out, or they remain invisible in the classroom. This is what I'm talking about. So it has huge implications in those countries. And by the way, if you talk about countries like Bangladesh, India, UNICEF, World Bank, they spend millions and millions of dollars. They are throwing this kind of money each year. They say, and they look at some projects, they're working in some countries, some small towns, but they say we are not making big progress or huge progress. What is the reason behind it? So what they are saying is we have some really good small scale projects, but the people who are coming out of the teacher education programs, that remains a big area where they say we should do something in teacher education, but what's being done is not enough. And what needs to be done, there are some important questions being asked, but not many people have answered that question yet. So what do we do? Well, first thing we need to ask this thing is, what do teachers need to learn for them to include everyone? This is the first important question. What kind of skills, attributes they need to have for them to teach everyone? And how best can we, or teacher education, or teacher educators, prepare them for in that role? What I find really helpful is a theory given by Shulman Lee. He talks about in any field, most importantly in education or teacher education, teachers need to have three things. They need to have a heart, head, and hands. What I believe in teacher education for inclusion, heart is most critical. That's the reason I'm using a triangle. This is the reason I'm putting them at the base of this foundation. They say heart is most critical, then you move toward head, and then the hands. But I want to reflect back on what's happening in our teacher education. Are teachers being prepared? Are their heart, head, and hands ready for inclusion? If you think about it, this is a figure, I mean, they are not truly based on research as such, but we do know when teachers come out of the program, they are not ready. Their heart is not ready, their head is not ready, their hands are not ready. So if you look at these figures, heart 10%, head 20%, hands 10%. So if you think about this is what is happening in teacher education, what kind of teachers coming out of the system? A handicapped teacher. And if you want to know, like in psychology we talk about DSM characteristics of a child who has a disability, I want to talk about the characteristics of teachers who come out of the system with this kind of program. These teachers do not believe that if a student misbehaves, something is wrong with the student. They believe that not all students can learn. They know very little about how to motivate all children. They know very little about how to make learning fun for all children. And they do nothing about students who fail or are ultimately excluded. So how do we prepare our teachers? If this is we know can happen if we do not do our if we do not prepare our teachers really well. I think we really need to think about that theory, head, heart, and hands are critical. We need to change heart first, then change head, the knowledge, what kind of skills do they need to require, and then work on their hands. So I want to repeat this thing. Heart is their belief, who should be coming to my classroom, who belongs in my classroom. Head is the kind of knowledge and skills they need to acquire during the teacher education program, and hands is to practice inclusion skills. So if you think about those three things, how do we move forward in our arena? It's easy for me to say change the heart, but it's a very difficult task to change someone's heart. We can legislate for inclusion, we can legislate for educational access, we cannot legislate for educators to change their beliefs or their heart. So we can have a Disability Discrimination Act, we can have education standards, we cannot make people to change their heart before they start teaching in our school system. There's World Report on Disability. What they talk about, that training of mainstream teachers should be focused upon attitudes and values, not just knowledge and skills. So it's really good to have this report. They say you should do it, but how do you do it remains questionable. What do we need to do in our teacher education so their hearts, they start believing in this idea that inclusion is good? I find this framework really helpful. Some of you might know about Simon Sinek, and if you are not, you can go on TED and look for his very inspiring lecture on leadership. He said people do something if they truly believe in an idea. And if they say, if people say why I want to do this thing, they will not want to do what they have to do, and they'll find how to do it. What we tend to do in our university programs a lot, we teach them what to do when you are in an inclusive classroom and how to do it. But rarely we talk about why should you include a child. We do talk about why should you include a child, but it's mainly because we have legislation in our country. That's why you should include it. But teachers do not see a value in including a child. They do not see that including a child could be beneficial for me. Rarely it's done in our teacher education program. So why remains something outside the teacher education program. So if you look at teacher education program, what we do really well, reasonably well, we have started talking about what kind of strategies do we need to learn about inclusion, and how we do place students in our school system where they learn some skills to including everyone, but not everything. But why still remains questionable. They do not understand why should I be including a child who is displaying severely challenging behavior. How is this going to help me? So that's an important question. That's what we are not doing really well in our program. So when we talk about inclusion, it's an extrinsically driven thing in our teacher education program. We are teaching about inclusion because it's coming from as a policy or legislation thing in our system. What's happening here? Sorry, it's not here, so I'm just going to look here. So it's more extrinsically driven, and this is the kind of question they are asking. If I do not include Tom in my classroom, can I be sued, or can my principal be sued? This is the kind of question they're asking. So I think it's more fear-driven agenda right now, not so much good that it will be good for me to include this child in my classroom setting. So what is most critical is teachers need to see this as an opportunity. So if they included Tom in their classroom, how will it make them a much better teacher? That's what is not happening as much as it should be. Now, this is also a question we asked about why, and this is a study done by one of our doctoral students where we went and talked to the deans of faculties of education in Bangladesh, 21 of them, and we wanted to know what do they believe about, what are their views about inclusion. So if you think about teacher educators, they are the top in any, so think about the dean of education in any faculty, that's where I think most of the curriculum are being developed and signed. When we talk to these people, they say it's a really good idea, idealistic thing, but I don't think we can do it. And they are not even doing in their teacher education program. So if you think about, that's where I'm talking about, if it's not happening at the highest level in universities, how can we have pre-service teachers coming out of those universities who are ready to include everyone? So how do we prepare our teachers so that they are not handicapped? If you think about if we can do few things in our teacher education program, that make people believe that inclusion is good for me and for my teaching, then you start teaching about what kind of skills do I need to acquire. It becomes much more easier for teachers to learn about those skills and those, that they have to learn. So if we have done this really well, then we start talking about the head, the knowledge. What kind of knowledge do we need to have? Teacher education and the head. Information covered in the program sometimes unintentionally prepare teachers for exclusion and not for inclusion. And I want to talk about what do we do in our teacher education that we have found from research in many countries that unfortunately prepare teachers for exclusion. Number one, teachers learn about various disabilities and characteristics of children with disabilities, and I can tell you what happens as a result of this. They'll learn that a child with Down syndrome cannot do this, this, and that. They'll learn a child with autism or autism spectrum disorder cannot do this, this, and this. And they do cover, so what we were doing in those teacher education programs, we are talking lots about what a child cannot do, what's wrong with the child. And they say, how about you have taught us about Down syndrome, you have taught us about autism spectrum disorder, but you haven't taught us enough about cerebral palsy. So they want to know more and more about disability. But what we are doing over here is, if we are presenting too much information to our students or our pre-service teachers about different disabilities, they start seeing what's wrong with the child. So what's happening in those teacher education programs, they become more concerned, they become more worried. They say, what will happen if I had a child like this coming to my classroom? They always start thinking about the most severe negative characteristics associated with the label coming to their classroom and how will they cope with that situation. So what we are doing also in our teacher education, how to assess what's wrong with the students. In some teacher education program, this is what we have seen. So this is what is happening in some of the countries. When we looked at the curriculum, they spent quite a lot of time in teaching students how will you find what's wrong with your student instead of telling them what's wrong with your own teaching. And they learn to label students. They say, okay, now you need to help me to identify what's wrong with this child. Can I use a checklist? So what they are doing is they're looking for those checklists, and those checklists are being trained. They are being trained to use those checklists, and they become almost qualified to label kids, even though they haven't got enough training. So they say, I have quite a few kids with ADHD in my classroom, and I say, how do you know that? They say, I use this checklist, and there are 10 questions, I asked that, and I think this child had ADHD. So if you think about giving that information in teacher education program, what we have done is we have prepared our teachers to label kids and exclude those kids. Now, if you talk about this, people say, but isn't that true that there is a special education pedagogy? So for example, for a child who has Down syndrome, there is one way to teach that child. For a child who has autism spectrum disorder, there is another way to teach that child. But what we know from research, this was research done in UK by Davis and Florian, where they did a systematic literature review to find out, is there a special education pedagogy? What they found, that there is a great deal of literature that might be construed as special education knowledge, but that the teaching approaches and strategies themselves were not sufficiently differentiated from those which are used to teach all children to justify the term special needs pedagogy. So this was a really interesting, a very powerful piece of research that came from UK. Then we talk about special education pedagogy. There are other researchers who say it is assumed that if something is going wrong with the schooling of a child, special measures are needed. Special assessment, special pedagogy in short. They say children who are slower to learn for whatever reason need the same in order to learn as any other child. They need the kind of things which our humanity tells us they need: interest, confidence, freedom from worry, a warm and patient teacher. It's what we are learning from this field of special education is that what works for children with special needs is likely to work with all other kids. So there is no special education pedagogy as such from this research. So how do we prepare our teachers? I'm just still talking about, if you're thinking about heart is ready, now the head is ready. The next thing is, finally we need to start thinking about what do we do for our teachers. Where should they go and learn about the skills to teach, or skills to include everyone? And I believe teaching in inclusive classrooms or in any classroom nowadays, it's like driving on icy roads. I was in Canada with one of my very good friend, Tim Lawman, a few years ago. And Tim told me, can you drive on these roads? I said, Tim, first of all, it's right-hand drive. The second thing, these are icy roads. And third thing, I do not have very good insurance. But if you still want me to drive, I'll do it. And as I drove maybe no more than a kilometer, I said, I don't want to drive. It's not good. Not good for me, not good for you, and it's not good for other people who are on this road. Because in my view, teaching is like that. When people think about teaching, they say it's going to be very easy. It will be easy to drive. But when you start teaching, you see kids coming from different learning needs in your classroom. So for teachers to be able to teach in those classrooms, they need to develop skills to drive on icy roads. They need to learn, how will I deal with kids coming from different learning needs in my classroom? How will I change my teaching so that everyone is learning in my classroom setting? This is one of the most difficult areas in teacher education, as much as I know. And also one of the areas where we have not done enough research yet. And these are some of the important questions if you want to know about this. Where should we place our graduates for teaching practicum? Now the question is, do we have icy roads? Do we have those classrooms where our L-platers or our new graduates coming from the universities can practice inclusive education skills? So this is a very, very important question. Like, we say teachers need to learn about inclusion. We place them, but the question is, are they learning the kinds of skills that they need to learn to drive on those roads? And what we know, in some schools, they do not get those skills even when they finish their teacher education program. Now you expect, or we expect, those teachers to be able to teach in those classrooms which are quite icy, where they have quite a large diversity in the classroom. So the question is, this is an important question. We need to start asking this in our teacher education program. The second thing is, how long should this placement be? Like, we have a requirement that it's 45 days for, according to VIT, that they should be doing placement. But my question is, when we are learning to drive, they say you should not be able to drive on your own unless you are fully confident and you have passed the driving test. But when we are placing our teacher, we are asking our teachers to teach. They say you can still teach even though you may not be completely ready or you're not fully confident. So is this really good, or do we need to do something about this? Next very important question is, who should supervise the teaching practice? Now, we have mentor teachers. We also have university lecturers supervising this. So who should be the driving instructor? Is someone who really is a good inclusive education teacher? Now think about this. When we place our students, what kind of mentors do they get? Do they get really good inclusive education educators who are training these people, or sometimes they're getting who are not so great inclusive education teachers when we are placing our students? And I think it will be important for us to go and do some observational studies, and will be something really interesting can come out. Now, how do we determine who is ready to teach in inclusive classrooms? So before we are about to give the licenses to people to teach, how do we decide that? How do we make that decision? What will happen if we had drivers with poorly developed skill driving on icy roads? Who should be responsible if poorly trained teachers or drivers are driving on our roads, leading to accidents? I'm talking about what happens in those classrooms. So if we have our classrooms, we start driving, and our teachers have started doing this thing, and if there are some students, they get excluded. Some of the students are being sent to principal's office. Some of the students might be sent, said, you do not belong in my classroom. And most of the time, who's suffering here? Our students sometime may suffer because of that teaching pedagogy. I want to share with you what we have found. This is a fundamental problem we are talking about. So how do you go about changing some of the things that is happening in teacher education? So we have done this research in many countries, in India, China, Bangladesh, and Solomon Islands. So what we try to do is we work with different universities where say, if we really want to change this system, people in the universities at the highest level, they need to buy in this agenda. They say, we do need to do something about this in our teacher education. They say, so the deans of faculties of education, they say, are you interested in this project? So the projects we have done in different countries was in collaboration with the highest level at the universities. It's the dean of education or faculty of education. They say, we are interested in this. Let's talk about this. So what we did in Solomon Islands as one of the projects, we worked with, there is a university, Solomon Islands National University, where there's only one university in the country. So if you think about, if we can do something in that university, you can change the whole country's education system or teacher education system. So we worked with that university in revising teacher education program to prepare teachers with 3H, head, heart, and hands. What we try to do in these universities, we had teacher educators. It's not the only teacher educator who teach in special education. We had everyone involved in teacher education. So they were the heads of departments of mathematics, heads of departments of science, visual arts, all the people who are teaching these programs. They came together and they needed to understand what is inclusion and why it's good for their teacher education program to be on this, to change their teacher education practices, and how they're going to bring this pedagogy when they're teaching about maths, when they're teaching about science, when they're teaching about English. So it was not something done by only one teacher educator or special educator. It was done by everyone in the teacher education program. But we knew if something like this has to happen in a university program, in a country like Solomon Island, it does need political will or policy makers to come on board. So what we tried to do in this project, we worked with the Ministry of Education that works directly with this university, and we brought them together. We said, people who are directly involved in teacher education program, writing curriculum, they should be on the same page. So we brought those two groups together, and the third most critical thing, we brought the school principals, because if you want to practice inclusion, you need to have those schools where they can provide IC roads, where they can provide support to our teachers. So what we did in this project, there was a team of teacher educators from Solomon Island. They came to Australia. They spent some time learning about this thing. They went back to Solomon Islands. They changed their teacher education program. They collected some data from their pre-service teachers, and they did this thing for 1 year. And they wanted to see what's happening as a result of this thing. One important thing that happened is, as a result of this first thing, teacher educators started believing that inclusion is good for them. So inclusion is good for what they are doing this thing, and they changed their teacher education program. They collected data on their pre-service teachers. They asked them, how confident do you feel about including children with disabilities and children with diverse learning needs? So they looked at this information, and what we have found, that after the first time they changed their teacher education, the confidence of pre-service teachers is higher compared to what they had in the previous years. So we collected this data last year. We have collected this data again this year. So clearly showing to teachers that things have started changing in the program. But we do know it will take some time before you start seeing changes happening at the community level, because these teachers need to go back, they need to start teaching, and they need to stay in the system for some time before you'll start seeing some changes. But what we do know is, in a country which is a small country like Solomon Island, if all teachers are on the same page, or new teachers coming out of the system are on the same page, after maybe 5 to 10 years, you will have those teachers who are preparing the community for inclusion. And I think it's important for us to talk about, when I'm talking about this thing. In countries like India, Bangladesh, we always talk about society's attitude as one of the most significant barriers to change, to include children with disabilities. And if you think about where do those attitudes come from, and if you talk about this in our teacher education programs, that's where most of the time we talk about who should not be included, and somehow we are reinforcing those attitudes. So if we could change this thing happening in our teacher education, we can create those societies, not right now, but after a few years. And this is the kind of projects we are doing in a few countries where we are finding, initial findings are, teacher educators have changed. Now what we are seeing is there is some impact at the middle level where pre-service teachers who are coming out of the system, they started believing inclusion is good for me, it's an opportunity. It's not that something I'm doing for others, it's something that I'm doing for myself. Because I want to learn to drive on icy roads, and it will make me a much better driver. And what we want to see in the next phase is what is the impact of this at the student level. Are students who were excluded in the past, they're becoming part of the system, or they're coming into the system. So this is a project that we are doing in a few countries, and I think hopefully we'll be able to present some data in the next few years, but quite optimistic about it. So what is the future research agenda? This is still something we are still working on, and I think this remains something I'm very keen to work on. How can change be facilitated in teacher education across the Asia Pacific, including Australia? So what we have found is in some universities, some deans of faculties of education, they are very keen to work with us. They say, I really want to change. But in other universities, they still see inclusion is not something we are interested in. So how do you bring those people on board unless they start believing that inclusion is good? So that's one of the biggest barriers or problems we face when we are working in this country. So it's more self-driven. Like when the dean says, I really want to change, they're coming on board. In other countries, it's not happening so much. But now we are also talking about Australia. I think that's where we are moving towards inclusion. And what we know in some universities, teachers are being prepared very well for inclusion. But in other universities, still it's not happening a lot. Now, we know we have data from some universities in Australia. Now, what we need to do is how can everyone come on the same page and we start moving forward in this direction. I want to conclude, and I want to conclude with some quotes. And what we are talking about changing the teacher education program, and I think a quote on change is a good idea here. Everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself. And if you think about that blaming picture where I was blaming myself, I'm trying to change some of the things I was doing in my teacher education, like when I was teaching. If you think about, I identified few things that we should not do in our teacher education. And one of the things I used to do, I used to talk a lot about what's wrong with a child in our teacher education program here at Monash. So I used to talk about characteristics of children. What I realized that once I collected some data after my program, I found that teachers became more worried. They became more concerned about inclusion. And I said, what's wrong with what I'm doing? And once I started looking at the research in this area, what I found, the things that I was doing in our program was not the best thing we should be doing. So I was preparing our teachers for exclusion that time. And something has changed since I looked at my own teaching. The second quote is, never believe that a few caring people can't change the world, for indeed that's all who ever have. And finally, it may be hard for an egg to turn into a bird. It would be jolly sight harder for it to learn to fly while remaining an egg. We are like eggs at present, and you cannot go on indefinitely being just an ordinary decent egg. We must be hatched or go bad. Thank you very much.